Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our friends and colleagues around the world. My name is Larry Kelly, and welcome to the third session of the inaugural series of the World Affairs program of the MIT Club. I am thrilled to kick off our new program on the subject of world affairs, democracy, and freedom. The goal is to examine world affairs and to promote understanding and advancement of democracy and freedom. By the way, there are very high winds in the Bay Area today. They knocked out the power to our Studio A, and so we had to move to Studio B. We're probably going to lose some other people tonight too. So this will be recorded and it will be available on the club's YouTube channel. So I'm especially thrilled and excited to have as our speaker today, Karis Templeman, a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, to talk about Taiwan, the People's Republic of China, and the preservation of peace across the Taiwan Strait. By the way, tonight's event has over 200 registrants. As we heard from Larry Diamond and Steve Pfeiffer in our prior two sessions, democracy is under pressure and in retreat around the world. Just reading today's news would give one enough material to fill up all the time allotted for our evening tonight. And I'm not going to do that, but I'll give a short sampling. In Ukraine, President Biden made a surprise trip to Kyiv yesterday and reaffirmed U.S. commitment to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. While there are some estimates that close to 200,000 Russian troops have been killed or wounded, and perhaps a comparable number of Ukrainians, there are now, according to Ukrainian officials, about 300,000 new Russian troops inside eastern Ukraine preparing for the next offensive, potentially to start in the next 10 days. Today, Putin also suspended Russian participation in the New START nuclear treaty. And also today, a surprise, a document was leaked from Putin's presidential administration detailing how Russia plans to take full control over Belarus by 2030. And of course, Friday represents the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. China, Karis is going to cover China. Iran, well, Bloomberg reports that uranium has been enriched up to 84% in Iran. Iran is supplying Russia with drones and has agreed to make to set up a drone manufacturing facility inside Russia. Here's some not so good news. Israel, nearly 100,000 Israelis protested outside the Knesset over proposed legislation which would allow the unicameral parliament to override the country's Supreme Court. And the court would no longer be able to nullify government decisions, thus removing checks and balances on the government. Is this a weakening of democracy in the most or perhaps the only democratic country in the Middle East? So that's some short news. By way of review, our speaker in December was Steve Pfeiffer, a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and senior fellow with the Brookings Institution. Steve gave a fabulous and thought-provoking talk on the war in Ukraine. Where are we now? That's available on our YouTube channel, and I will put the link to that in the chat box momentarily. So it's now, and so if you want to see Steve's talk or hear Larry Diamond's talk, Larry was our original speaker at the beginning of the series. Go to the YouTube channel. They're very good. So it's now my privilege to introduce our speaker for today, Karis Templeman. Karis is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and is the manager of the project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region. And he's also a lecturer at the Center for East Asian Studies at Stanford. His areas of expertise include democratic transitions and consolidations, comparative parties and elections, and the politics of Taiwan. Karis worked on Taiwan for 22 years, speaks Mandarin, and he's been there long enough to see many significant changes in Taiwan, PRC, and the US. And he's just come back from there. So before we start, Karis, your background. You grew up in Eastern Oregon. You received your undergrad degree from the University of Rochester and your PhD from the University of Michigan. Tell us a little bit about your formative years. Were there any interesting people, I'm sure there were, during your early years that had significant influence on you?
Sure. Well, thank you, Larry, for having me here for this talk. Following Larry Diamond and Steve Pfeiffer is those are big shoes to fill, so I'll try to do that today. But the bar is very high already. So my formative years, I grew up in a small town in Eastern Oregon. It's the kind of place where the same people you go to kindergarten with, you graduate from high school with, you kind of get defined as a certain type of student, a certain, from a certain family and so forth. And so um, my desire was really to get out and see the world as soon as I graduated from high school. And so I went to the other side of the country, and that's really where I kind of got the China bug. I took a class on Chinese politics at the University of Rochester, taught by Melanie Mannion, who's now a senior professor at Duke University. And it was a fantastic class. She is incredibly knowledgeable about China, was one of the first Westerners to get into China and study as a student in 1978 when China was just opening up again. And that really inspired me to take Chinese and to try to go to China and study abroad there. So that was she was a major formative figure in my certainly my career development. Since then, at the University of Michigan, I had a couple great faculty members there who really kind of shaped my thinking about politics and international relations as well. Alan Hicken is an expert on Southeast Asian studies. He was a major influence on my intellectual development there. And then Mary Gallagher as well at the University of Michigan, the China person there. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there. But I'm certainly whatever I present today is I'm standing on the shoulders of giants who came before me. So
You're so very kind to them.
well, I've certainly been blessed to be in the presence of people with very sharp minds and to learn a ton from all of those people. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and get off here. Just one last housekeeping detail for the audience. We've enabled the chat for questions, and I'll do my best to get these questions to Karis during the Q&A, along with the questions that came in from the online registration. However, tonight's large audience means that we'll only be able to get to a small number of the questions. So I'll be back after Karis's talk to cover the Q&A. So go for it, big guy.
All right. Well, thank you, Larry, for the opportunity. And I do have some slides that I'd like to show. Let's see if I can get these to show here. And let's also play. All right, Larry, can these slides can be viewed by the audience?
I can.
You can see them. Okay. Well, that's good. All right. So I will jump in. The question I wanted to motivate this talk with is the question that seems to be on a lot of people's minds right now, and that is, can peace be preserved across the Taiwan Strait? And another way to put this is, if peace cannot be preserved, then is war across the Taiwan Strait inevitable? I presume everybody watching this talk has some idea of where Taiwan is and why its international status might be controversial, why the PRC might be interested in claiming it as its own territory. And you've probably read some of the headlines over the past year or two with some pretty dire warnings from various senior officials in the US government or the US military predicting a conflict with China over Taiwan in the next few years. The most recent, most prominent one was General Minahan. This is from, I guess, last month, predicted that we might be in a conflict with China as soon as 2025. That's just 2 years away. This is actually not unique to Minahan or the Air Force or any other senior official. There's tons of writing these days, all with lots of it with a similar kind of dangerous framing, with Taiwan and a big target on it. The Economist last year named Taiwan the most dangerous place on earth. I personally think I would much prefer to be in Taiwan today rather than Ukraine or probably 24 other places on the planet right now. But this is kind of the narrative surrounding Taiwan today. To put my bottom line up front, I do not think war is inevitable across the Taiwan Strait, and I'll go into why in this talk. But I do think we're at a kind of a dangerous moment in US-China relations right now. In effect, we're in a kind of security dilemma where each side is at risk of misinterpreting the other side's intentions. Each side risks kind of making a move that triggers a counter response from the other side, and we end up in a kind of spiraling insecurity situation across the strait. I'm also going to argue that this insecurity spiral or dilemma started at a very specific moment, May of 2016, when the current president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, took office, gave a speech, a fairly conciliatory speech that Beijing thought didn't go far enough. And ever since, Beijing has been tightening the screws on her government to try to undercut her popularity and direct Taiwan voters towards voting for a more China-friendly leader in the next election. So the fundamental source of the conflict or the confrontation between the US and China these days over Taiwan, I think, really can be traced specifically to the 2016 election and the results of that. And more generally, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of US-China relations, both about the US's present and potential future trajectory, and also about China's future trajectory under Xi Jinping. There's a lot of uncertainty about what his leadership will mean for China over the next few years. So I'll try to dig into all of these issues in the rest of this talk. So roadmap, here's where I'm headed. I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S. People's Republic of China, Taiwan trilateral relationship, how we got here to this particular moment. Second, I'm going to cover relations specifically in the Xi Jinping era since 2012, what's changed in the trilateral relationship. Third, I'm going to talk a bit about debates in the U.S. with respect to China and Taiwan. So timelines, are there windows of opportunity for one side or the other to kind of lock in an advantage, and a debate over how important asserting sovereignty or control over Taiwan is for Xi Jinping. And then finally, I'm an optimist. It's a character flaw, but I'm going to try to give you the optimistic case for why peace can be preserved across the Taiwan Strait, and on what I hope is a more hopeful note for the present and future of US-Taiwan PRC relations. All right, so that's where I'm headed. All right, so first, let's talk a little bit about the trilateral relationship. How did we get here? First, some of you may not know, but Taiwan was actually not part of, it was not under the control of any Chinese regime for 50 years. It was actually transferred to Japanese control at the end of the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. Japan governed it as its first and kind of model colony for 50 years, from 1895 to 1945. It was then, under the terms of the Cairo Declaration of 1943, transferred back to Chinese control. At that point, the Chinese regime was the Republic of China with its capital in Nanjing. And so following the terms of the Cairo Declaration, the nationalist government was flown to Taiwan to accept the surrender from Japanese authorities on the island. That nationalist rule over Taiwan quickly went badly. And within 2 short years, there was massive discontent with nationalist rule. There was an uprising against the Kuomintang, or Chinese Nationalist Party. And that was put down ruthlessly, with anywhere from 5,000 to 30,000 people killed in that crackdown. And that effectively silenced the voice of what I'll call native Taiwanese or native-born Taiwanese for about 40 years. Unfortunately for Jiang and the nationalists, the Chiang Kai-shek-led regime on the mainland quickly lost ground to the Chinese Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War. And rather ironically, Taiwan was one of the last pieces to come under nationalist control. After World War II, it was in turn the last place that they ended up. They were forced to retreat to Taiwan as their last bastion in the Chinese Civil War. And so the Chiang Kai-shek-led government fled from the interior of China to Taiwan and set up a temporary capital in Taipei in December of 1949. So how did the U.S. get involved? This is all about China and the end of World War II, the Chinese Civil War. The U.S. was not initially inclined to get involved in protecting Taiwan and keeping the Nationalist Party alive on the island of Taiwan. So there's actually a very clear statement of intent from President Truman himself in January 1950, where the U.S. declared it would not pursue a course which would lead to involvement in the Chinese Civil War. So in effect, President Truman, he was sick of providing aid to the nationalists and watching it be squandered or siphoned into private bank accounts. And he said, effectively, we're going to wash our hands of this mess. We're not going to provide any more aid to the nationalist regime that's now located on the island of Taiwan, Formosa. And we'll stand back and let nature take its course, basically. So that was the U.S. position for about 6 months on Taiwan. And then something pretty dramatic changed in the region, and that was North Korea invaded South Korea. And so North Korea on June 25th, 1950, declared they were going to try to unite the Koreas under a communist regime. That very quickly then led to a dramatic repositioning of U.S. forces. The U.S. moved into Korea to try to fight back the communist invasion. And it also dramatically changed the importance of the nationalist regime on Taiwan to the United States. And so Taiwan went from being a kind of, a legacy of the Chinese Civil War and one that was a liability for the United States to, in a matter of days, an asset, an unsinkable aircraft carrier off the coast of Red China, and one that needed to be protected at all costs. And so Truman dramatically changed his language on Taiwan and said, we are going to prevent any attack on Formosa as a result of the North Korean invasion of South Korea. And so, in effect, Truman's decision in June 1950 meant that the U.S. inserted itself into the middle of the Chinese Civil War. We took a side. We prevented the invasion of a PLA armada across the strait to finish off the nationalists. And in fact, the U.S. has been there ever since. We have been the primary, if not sole, guarantor of Taiwan's security and de facto autonomy vis-a-vis the PRC. The U.S. objectives in this relationship with the ROC on Taiwan, they have been first and foremost to preserve peace and stability in the region. They were also, even from the earliest days, aimed at maintaining a good environment for regional trade and economic growth. It's not a coincidence that Taiwan was one of the 4 Asian tigers whose growth took off in the 1960s and 70s. Taiwan today is one of the most prosperous places in the world. At purchasing power parity equivalent, Taiwan's GDP per capita is the equivalent of Germany. So it's a quite wealthy, prosperous place. And that is in part because of the U.S. security guarantee, and in part because the U.S. And Taiwan have had longstanding economic ties. And Taiwan was able to grow very rapidly because of that. Third, another important U.S. objective has been to ensure a friendly and non-communist, and later, as Taiwan democratized, a democratic regime on Taiwan. And finally, and this point gets lost a lot in conversations about Taiwan, but this has been a longstanding objective in U.S. relations, And that is to see Taiwan develop as a counterpoint to the People's Republic of China and to influence both its economic and its political development. So Taiwan, from this perspective, is a kind of avatar for the PRC, or a kind of example or model that the US would like to see the PRC follow. That's been a longstanding kind of hope for Taiwan's growth, that it could influence the PRC in positive ways that benefit US interests. Right. So I'll go quickly through some key moments in the US-ROC alliance. In 1952, Japan actually renounced any claim to Taiwan, any remaining claim in the Treaty of San Francisco, which ended the US occupation of Japan. A couple years later, the US and the Republic of China on Taiwan signed a mutual defense treaty. So we had a formal defense alliance with the ROC, which legally obligated the US to come to Taiwan's defense from 1954 on. That treaty did not include Jinmen or Matsu, which are these teeny little islands off the coast of mainland China that were still under the control of the nationalist regime. But in a kind of ironic twist, Chiang Kai-shek put a huge number of troops on Jinmen and Matsu and effectively called the US's bluff. And so the US had to be concerned about the fall of those two islands because it potentially opened up Taiwan to a PRC invasion down the road. And so Chiang Kai-shek managed to convince the US that he would be allowed to keep control of Jinmen and Matsu, and they remain part of the Republic of China territory today. They're administered under a government whose capital is in Taipei rather than in Beijing. Despite this strong alliance with the United States, the Republic of China kept losing ground to the People's Republic of China from the 50s on. And so by 1971, the Republic of China, which up until that point had actually held the China seat on the UN Security Council, they actually lost that seat as a result of a vote of the General Assembly, and they were kicked out of that body. Shortly after that, President Nixon actually shocked the nationalist regime in Taipei by visiting China and issuing a joint communique with the PRC leadership, expressing an interest in moving towards normalization of ties. And a corollary to that was we would probably have to break off relations with the Republic of China on Taiwan. Nixon wasn't able to complete that initiative because he wasn't president for a whole lot longer. But this kind of set the precedent for how US PRC relations would evolve and eventually set the ground for the Carter administration to normalize relations in 1979. There's a couple key things I want to call your attention to in the US language on Taiwan and the PRC. The first is the US side made a couple diplomatically tricky statements here. So the United States acknowledges in this joint communique that all Chinese are on both sides of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China, and that Taiwan is a part of China, but acknowledges is not the same as accept. And so the US position from this point forward was that we acknowledge the Chinese position, but we do not endorse it or accept it. And we do not challenge it, but we also do not agree with that position. And so ever since, the US position on Taiwan has been effectively that its status in the interstate system is unsettled, undecided, and that mutual recognition of Taiwan's status requires voluntary consent of both the people and government of Taiwan and the people and government of the PRC. The second major moment in US-ROC relations is in 1979, when the Carter administration switches recognition from the ROC to the PRC and also abrogates the Mutual Defense Treaty as a consequence of recognizing the PRC. That takes place on January 1st, 1979. The Carter administration breaks off diplomatic relations with the Republic of China and Taiwan. US military personnel are pulled out of Taiwan and the embassy closes. And that surprises Congress. Congress rapidly drafts and passes something called the Taiwan Relations Act in April. And that means that Congress becomes directly involved in the conduct of foreign policy towards Taiwan. And this is almost unique in US foreign policy towards the rest of the world. Congress actually has an important legal role to play in shaping US policy towards Taiwan. And so many of you are probably aware that Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan last year. Part of the reason that was so politically sensitive for all sides was that she was the top representative of Congress, and in that capacity was visiting Taiwan to demonstrate that body's support for Taiwan. The framework under which the U.S. Recognized the People's Republic of China, but maintained some kind of unofficial diplomatic relations with Taiwan with the people of Taiwan is as follows. So the U.S. has something now called our One China policy, and that's kind of shorthand to describe all of the agreements and both legal and diplomatic that govern our relations with the people of Taiwan. So to the United States, as of January 1st, 1979, the Republic of China on Taiwan no longer exists. It's no longer mentioned in US official documents. Instead, the standard language is the people of Taiwan and sometimes the government or leadership of Taiwan. To preserve normalization of relations with Beijing, US-Taiwan interaction has to be unofficial. In practice, what that has meant is that the US side created a sort of de facto embassy that they couldn't call an embassy. It's called the American Institute in Taiwan, or AIT, that handles all of the kind of diplomatic relations with the Taiwan government and all of the kind of tasks that a typical embassy handles. So issuing visas, arranging visits, communicating with counterparts on the Taiwan side, and so forth. And the Taiwan side was able to create an equivalent to that. It's not called an embassy. It's called the Taipei Economic, Cultural, and Representative Office, but it has an office in Washington, D.C. And the Taiwan de facto ambassador can't be called an ambassador. He's called the representative of Taiwan. He maintains the old ROC diplomatic estate called Twin Oaks in Washington, D.C., and she can hold events there, but under the US's One China policy, one of the many kind of unusual things about this is that ambassador cannot actually live at that facility. They can only hold events there. All of this kind of word games and procedural hoops that people have to jump through is intended to signal the US's commitment to an unofficial only relationship with the people and government of Taiwan. And in addition, what that has meant is that high-level contacts between the two sides are limited to preserve our commitment to a One China policy. There's some specific security aspects of the Taiwan Relations Act that are intended to ensure security support for Taiwan, but also not to draw the United States into a conflict with the PRC. And so this is often described as a kind of dual deterrence goal. There are two contradictory goals at stake here. The first is to deter a People's Republic of China attack against Taiwan. So the TREA has specific language about threats from any hostile power against Taiwan being of grave concern to the United States. But the U.S. also wants to avoid being drawn into a conflict because of something that the Taiwan side does that provokes the PRC. And so the U.S. also does not take an open, explicit stance pledging to defend Taiwan or to react in a certain specific way to threats or military actions against Taiwan. And so these two contradictory goals are often summed up under the label strategic ambiguity. Now, there's no US document that actually uses the term strategic ambiguity to describe our policy, but it's used as shorthand for this broader kind of dual deterrence goals. On the one hand, to deter an attack, but on the other hand, to prevent entrapment by the Taiwan side in a conflict that we don't want to fight. The language of the Taiwan Relations Act used to express strategic ambiguity. U.S. will view any effort to determine the future of Taiwan by other than peaceful means, including by boycotts or embargoes, as a threat to the peace and security of the Western Pacific area and of grave concern to the United States. This is the only language that governs our security posture vis-a-vis Taiwan. So you'll note there's no explicit commitment of the U.S. to intervene in a conflict, to come to Taiwan's aid. And it gives the President of the United States incredibly wide latitude to decide what to do or not to do in the case of a threat against Taiwan. There's a provision in the TRA for arms sales to Taiwan that determines that the U.S. will provide defense articles and services in a quantity that's necessary to maintain a sufficient self-defense capacity. And the president and the Congress have a legal obligation to determine that and then to provide those arms. And so the U.S. has been, for the last 30 plus years, Taiwan's sole external supplier of defense arms, of weaponry and services. This became a major touchstone in the US-PRC relationship in the early 80s. The People's Republic of China was very upset that the United States continued to sell weaponry to Taiwan, even though we had normalized relations with the PRC and broken off formal diplomatic ties with the ROC on Taiwan. And so as a consequence, the US and the PRC negotiated a third joint communique in which the United States linked our policy of arms sales to Taiwan to the cross-strait security balance. And we noted that if the security threat to Taiwan declined, our intention was to gradually reduce our arms sales to Taiwan, leading over a period of time to a final resolution between the two sides of the strait. But in addition to that, the Reagan administration, which negotiated this third joint communique, also promised the Taiwan side something that became known as the Six Assurances. And that was that while issuing this joint communique with the PRC, we also would not commit to setting a date to end arms sales. We would not hold any consultations with the PRC about arms sales. We would not try to mediate between the two sides. We would not revise the Taiwan Relations Act. We would not change our position on sovereignty over Taiwan, and we would not pressure the ROC to enter any kind of peace negotiations with the PRC. And so this has gained more attention and prominence in recent years because there's a classified memo that was recently made public from the Reagan era that made it clear that the US government's position under his administration was that we would continue to sell arms as long as we saw a serious military threat to Taiwan from the PRC, and that our arms sales would be linked to the balance. And so in recent years, both Republican and Democratic administrations have ramped up arms sales to Taiwan. And my own view is that those arms sales are not inconsistent with our own One China policy or the set of agreements that we've made with the PRC, because they are linked explicitly to the rising military imbalance across the strait. And we're trying to kind of level up the Taiwan side so that they're in a better position to negotiate or interact with the PRC side without feeling unduly threatened. So all of that diplomatic jargon aside, let me see if I can sum up U.S. policy towards Taiwan and the PRC in plain language. First off, the U.S. has a clear strategic interest in preventing a conflict between the two sides of the strait. The US does not, and I need to reiterate this, does not have an interest in unilateral changes to Taiwan's international status. So the US does not recognize Taiwan as an independent country. The US had to make that pledge to the PRC in order to achieve normalization of relations in 1979, and we maintain that position today. We also do not have any interest in seeing either Taiwan or the PRC try to unilaterally change Taiwan's status to conform closer to their own preferences. The US also, in effect, considers Taiwan's international status to be unsettled or undetermined. Bottom line for the United States, to settle Taiwan's status requires peaceful and voluntary agreement between both the PRC and the people of Taiwan. And so unilateral changes by either side are unacceptable to the United States. And that has been our position really ever since 1979 in the normalization of diplomatic relations. Let me talk a little bit about the view from Beijing and why Taiwan is so important to the Chinese Communist Party. First off, territorial integrity is a big part of the CCP's claim to legitimacy and the right to rule China. So Taiwan was among the territories that were lost during the century of humiliation, from beginning in the mid-1800s on through 1949. And so in the CCP's narrative about Taiwan, it must be retaken. It is a core territorial interest. And failure to do so is a dereliction of duty as the ruler of a Chinese regime. The CCP also asserts that Taiwan is a problem left over from the Chinese Civil War, and not without reason, that the nationalist regime was defeated by the communists, and if it hadn't been for US intervention, this would no longer be a problem, and Taiwan would be part of the PRC today. And so the US is the key problem here. Initially, ironically, the Kuomintang, the nationalist regime, and the CCP, the PRC regime, both had the same view about Taiwan's territorial status. They initially viewed it as an inalienable part of China and one that could not be separated from the rest of China. But they simply disagreed over which government or which regime was the rightful ruler of all of China. From Beijing's perspective, ever since Beijing got into the UN, and certainly since the United States recognized the PRC over the ROC, that question has been effectively settled. And there's no going back. Taiwan has always been considered part of China. Now that it's clear that the PRC is the rightful representative of all of China, there's nothing else to talk about, and the US just needs to accept that. In order to try to enforce this position, the PRC's approach to achieving unification has varied quite a lot over time. So from the 1950s on until 1978, the PRC actively pursued a strategy of military liberation of Taiwan as the ultimate strategy to achieve unification. And so because they couldn't engage in an invasion across the strait, the small offshore islands of Jinmen and Matsu became kind of the front line of this frozen conflict, or not so frozen, in fact, a hot conflict for much of this period. And so it may not be well known to this crowd, but until 1979, Jinmen was actually receiving incoming artillery fire on an almost daily basis. And so in the 1950s, these two offshore islands were the source of two crises between the US and the PRC over the threat of invasion and a question about whether the US would respond to that. By the 1960s, the PRC and the ROC had arranged a kind of informal agreement about how they would interact with one another on Jinmen and Matsu. So Jinmen was shelled regularly, but they arranged a kind of modus vivendi where the PRC side would fire shells on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and the ROC side would fire shells back at the mainland on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and on Sunday, both sides took a day off and went out and kind of collected shells, cleaned up and so forth. And that sort of kind of ritualistic shelling of the other side actually continued regularly until the normalization of relations with the United States in 1979. With that normalization, the CCP's approach to Taiwan changed pretty dramatically. So they went from pursuing military liberation of Taiwan as their ultimate objective to a very different approach, the idea that they could actually achieve something that they called peaceful unification, where the ROC on Taiwan would come into the PRC in some kind of confederation. Deng Xiaoping was the first to propose a one country, two systems model for Taiwan. This was the same formula under which Hong Kong ultimately did accede to PRC control in 1997, but that was originally developed with Taiwan in mind. And so in addition, the PRC shelling stopped. There was much more kind of outreach and a very different kind of attitude and approach from Beijing towards Taipei. That approach looked like it was going to make some leeway or make some headway in the relationship until the mid-1990s, when Taiwan began to democratize. The president at that time of Taiwan, Lee Teng-hui, in order to get to win elections, actually started to move away from the idea of unification as the ROC's core position. And instead started to talk about there being two sides of the Taiwan Strait that did not belong to the same country and whose futures could evolve independently of one another. And so that language really alarmed the leadership in Beijing. They initially tried to influence Taiwan's first presidential election in 1996 by engaging in military exercises in and near the waters of Taiwan. And ultimately, they tried to prevent a declaration of independence by threatening to fire missiles at Taiwan. And with some intervention of the US, they did stop a declaration of independence. But it wasn't until 2005 that the PRC got a lot smarter, in my view, and started to pursue a kind of dual track strategy. So in addition to sticks, threats against Taiwan for pursuing independence, they also tried to offer some more carrots. So some kind of attraction for pursuing closer relations with the PRC. So the carrots included economic incentives. It included an effort to partner with friendly allies in Taiwan. By this time, the Kuomintang was actually the more China-friendly of the parties in the Taiwanese party system. Rather ironically, the opposition to the KMT that had grown up, the Democratic Progressive Party, was much more China skeptical and much more pro-independence. And so the leader of Taiwan from 2000 to 2008, Chen Shui-bian, actually had very poor relations with Beijing and increasingly fraught relations with the United States as well. And Beijing effectively and fairly successfully managed to bypass him and reach out to other parts of Taiwanese political society and develop relations and exchanges with them. And so starting in 2008, there was a much more China-friendly government that came into power in Taiwan under the President Ma Ying-jeou. With the KMT back in power, they signed a number of cross-strait agreements. They started cross-strait flights. They introduced mass tourism from the PRC into Taiwan and tried to, both sides were interested in deepening economic integration and allowing Taiwan to benefit from China's rapid economic growth. The real critical break in this strategy was in 2016 when a DPP candidate won the presidential election. Tsai Ing-wen took office, and Beijing was back to an emphasis on carrots, on sticks much more, on threatening punishment of the Taiwan government unless they accepted that Taiwan was part of China and that it should work with Beijing to achieve some kind of unification. But although what you've probably heard about most in the news is kind of incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, military exercises, threats, belligerent rhetoric towards the Tsai Ing-wen government in Taipei. there's also continued this other track, this kind of carrots or soft track, that includes selective engagement with other parts of the Taiwanese political spectrum who are friendlier to Beijing. And so several KMT chair people have in succession gone over to Beijing and met with the top leadership there. There was just a deputy chair of the KMT who was in Beijing a couple of weeks ago and met with Wang Huning, the Politburo member who's been tasked apparently by Xi Jinping with revising their Taiwan policy. And so despite the threats, there also remains significant people-to-people exchanges between the two sides up until the present day. And so all of this, in my view, suggests Beijing has not given up on the idea of peaceful unification, and that they can potentially, if they get a more pliable partner in Taipei, they might be able to achieve some movement towards unification on Beijing's terms. And in fact, if you take nothing else away from this talk, I want to emphasize here very strongly that there is a clear logic to what Beijing is doing in the cross-strait relationship that does not suggest a military invasion is imminent. So Beijing since 2016 has really since 2005, but the key parts of this have been ramped up since 2016. Beijing has been engaged in what I'm calling a dual track Taiwan strategy. So this dates back to 2005 with Hu Jintao's reassessment of Taiwan policy. It was put on ice from 2008 to 2016 when Beijing wanted to work with a KMT administration in Taipei. It's reemerged after a DPP president, Tsai Ing-wen, was elected in 2016. Tsai Ing-wen gave what I thought was a fairly conciliatory inauguration speech, acknowledging that the Republic of China on Taiwan had a kind of one China principle contained within it, the constitutional framework she accepted as the legitimate framework of Taiwan. She pledged to uphold the cross-strait status quo and not to pursue independence. And she accepted that the two sides of the strait had made significant progress in the past 8 years. None of that for Beijing was good enough. Beijing wanted her to state explicitly that Taiwan was part of China and that both sides had an obligation to work towards unification under a one country, two systems model. Tsai Ing-wen would not and could not, frankly, accept that position. It probably would have torpedoed her presidency on the first day in office. And so she went about 80% of the way towards where Beijing wanted her to go, but could not go the last 20%. And as a consequence, Beijing said, not good enough. You failed this exam. and as a consequence, we will squeeze your government. We will cut off all ties. We will put pressure diplomatically, economically, and politically. And yet we will continue, in fact, ramp up some of our softer parts of our dual track strategy. So the soft track includes continued economic ties, people-to-people exchanges, and selective engagement with political elites. It includes notably cross-strait flights. So prior to 2008, you could not get on a commercial flight and go from Taipei to Beijing or anywhere else on the mainland. You actually had to travel through Hong Kong and transfer. After 2008, those flights were inaugurated, put in place, and up until the present day, they have not been canceled or disrupted. COVID reduced the number dramatically, but they still remain in place, and you can still get on a flight in Taipei today and be in Beijing in a couple of hours. What has really dominated the kind of foreign coverage of the cross-strait relationship is the hard track, though. And so to try to punish Tsai Ing-wen for not accepting Beijing's preferred version of the one China principle, Beijing has ramped up diplomatic and military coercion. It's attempted to interfere in domestic politics, both openly and covertly. It has also imposed kind of select economic punishments against core DPP constituencies. So one example here, Beijing without notice, suddenly banned the import of Taiwanese pineapples to the PRC with the claim that they violated some kind of pest control protocol. The reason that was politically sensitive is that pineapple farmers tend to be located in southern Taiwan, and they tend to vote for the DPP in elections. And so that was a way to try to punish core DPP constituencies for continuing to support a DPP president in elections. That's the kind of approach that the dual track strategy has entailed. The goals of this strategy over the long run have been to undermine the DPP, bolster China-friendly forces in Taiwan, and in fact, this actually worked during the Chen Shui-bian era from 2000 to 2008. Also to deter moves towards independence. This is targeted both at Taiwan and at US leaders. That also has effectively worked. The current president of Taiwan has made it clear she is not interested in a de jure declaration of independence. And the US generally has supported maintenance of the status quo, has not come out in support of a declaration of independence or moves towards de jure recognition of Taiwan. And then a third objective here is to raise the attraction of unification so that voters in Taiwan will be especially interested or attracted to the idea of unification because it will benefit them economically or perhaps diplomatically as well, that they might be able to enjoy some of the benefits of being PRC nationals instead of Taiwan nationals. On the hard track, there have also been military incursions, but as well, some what I'll call lawfare. So the arbitrary detention of Taiwanese, the pressure on US businesses to change how they refer to Taiwan in their own documents. So a classic example here is that US airlines were forced by PRC regulatory authorities to change how they listed Taiwan destinations on their websites. They had to drop the Taiwan part of the destination. And so you'll notice if you go to the Delta website today and you try to book a flight to Taiwan and you choose Taipei, it used to say Taipei, Taiwan. Now it just says Taipei. Beijing wanted them to list it as Taipei, China. Delta kind of half-heartedly complied with this demand, but ultimately they gave in to the core demand, which was not to list Taipei as Taiwan as a separate place, distinct from China. And part of the reason for that was that Delta was threatened with regulatory punishment from the regulators in the PRC. The PRC has also flipped some of Taiwan's few remaining diplomatic allies. Taiwan in 2016, when Tsai Ing-wen came into office, had 23 remaining allies. Now it has only 14 countries, and the Vatican, if you consider the Vatican a country, that still recognize the Republic of China on Taiwan rather than the People's Republic of China with its capital in Beijing. And they're likely to continue flipping diplomatic allies of Taiwan as well into the future. And as I noted, they've imposed kind of sudden arbitrary bans on Taiwanese exports to the PRC, mostly in the agricultural sector. But they've continued this soft track as well. And so they've continued selective engagement. CCP representatives still talk to KMT representatives. They even talk to non-KMT representatives. So there's a party that grew up after the 2020 election called the Taiwan People's Party, or TPP. The former mayor of Taipei, Ke Wen-je, has tried to position this party between the DPP and KMT on cross-strait issues. Ke at one point stated that the two sides of the strait were part of the same family. Beijing liked that expression and then approved a delegation of Chinese athletes to attend a sporting competition held in Taipei in 2017. And I could go through a whole laundry list of other activities where Beijing has been willing to engage with any political party on the Taiwan side that does not openly advocate for Taiwanese independence or does not deny the fundamental idea that Taiwan is part of a greater China, and that it may potentially be unified with the PRC in the future. Cross-strait flights have continued, as I noted. The various agreements of the Ma era have continued, have been honored. The 10-year date for abrogating some of those agreements actually passed in 2020 without a peep. And so Beijing has been very selective in the kinds of punishments that it has attempted to impose on the Tsai administration without trying not to undermine the cross-strait people-to-people and economic ties that it hopes might draw Taiwanese people closer to the PRC and advocate for unification in the future. And they've also rolled out some benefits for Taiwanese living on the mainland. So that's the view from Beijing. Let me now turn briefly to Taiwan. I won't spend too much time on this. The key development here in Taiwan is that Taiwan, starting in the late 1980s, democratized. Martial law in Taiwan was in place for 38 years, from 1949 until 1987, actually. After it was lifted, Taiwan gradually liberalized and then moved towards full democracy, including direct election of the president, finally in 1996. That process boosted Taiwan's international image. It also created an opening for pro-independence politicians to win power and to advocate for new policies. And fundamentally, and most importantly, it inserted public opinion into cross-strait relations. So increasingly, Taiwan politics domestically evolved around what I'll call the China issues. Should Taiwan be part of China in the future? Should it declare independence? Or should it pursue some policy in between those two extremes? And so on one side, you have the Kuomintang with its traditional Chinese unification platform. On the other side, you have the Democratic Progressive Party with its traditional Taiwanese independence platform. And in recent years, both of these parties have moderated their position somewhat to be closer to the median voter in the electorate, who typically supports some version of the status quo rather than independence or unification. I'll just go quickly through this. Martial law was lifted in 1987, direct election of the legislature in 1992, first direct presidential election in 1996. First peaceful transfer of power. So the KMT first lost power. It was in power from 1949 all the way until 2000. First lost power in 2000 and the DPP came in. There's a second rotation of power in 2008 when the KMT came back into power and under the presidency of Ma Ying-jeou. And then the third transfer of power from the KMT back to the DPP in 2016. The consequences of democratization for the trilateral relationship are pretty clear. First and foremost, Taiwanese public opinion actually matters for the cross-strait relationship. In addition, the kind of pro-independence views that both the KMT and the CCP despised in the pre-democratic era, those could no longer be suppressed. People can debate Taiwan's national identity, its future, and suggest futures that involve something other than cross-strait unification. And increasingly, elections in Taiwan have become reoriented around the China issue. And so I wanted to show you all briefly some of the kind of basic public opinion patterns in Taiwan. So I'm going to show you three charts here. The first is a set of public opinion polls that have been done by a university in Taipei called National Zhengzhi University. The Election Studies Center there has polling data going back to the early 1990s, and they've consistently asked the same question of the electorate over this time period. They ask you, what is your national identity? So do you consider yourself to be Chinese, Taiwanese, or both? Or in Chinese, 你认为你是台湾人还是中国人还是都是? And the trend here should be pretty clear to anybody looking at this slide. The number of, or the share of the electorate identifying as Taiwanese has gone up pretty consistently over the past 30 years. It started out well below half. Now it's well above half of the electorate who identify exclusively as Taiwanese. The share of the electorate that identifies just as Chinese has fallen to almost negligible levels now. It's almost It's below 3% of all respondents. And then somewhere between 30 and 50% of the electorate identifies as both Chinese and Taiwanese. And it turns out when you dig into the numbers here, they vary a lot by the context and the specific kind of political circumstances surrounding when the survey is asked. So some people actually identify differently depending on what's happening in international relations or in Taiwan elections or so forth. Second survey data picture I'll show you is a question about whether you support independence or unification or neither. So support for independence here is summed up by the dark green and light green lines. Support for independence as soon as possible is the dark green line here towards the bottom. That has never been especially high in Taiwanese politics. The highest it's ever been was in the late 2000s, where it crested 10%. In the share of the electorate who support maintaining the status quo now and potentially moving towards independence in the future, that has continued to move up, though. And so a lot more Taiwanese now today would support moving towards independence in the future than the share who support moving towards unification in the future. The support for unification immediately has also, like independence, never been very high. It's now down well below 5% of the electorate. Support for unification sometime in the future is also now low. So those two categories together are now down below 10%. But the big takeaway here, and the one thing I really want you to get from this is that even today, the majority of Taiwanese express support for some version of the status quo, either maintaining the status quo indefinitely or maintaining the status quo and deciding at some distant point off in the future. So there isn't evidence from these data of some kind of groundswell of public opinion in favor of a de jure declaration of independence that would dramatically change Taiwan's international status. There is a jump in this move towards support for independence sometime in the future. But again, note that independence today, now, immediately, there's still not very much support for that. The third set of trends I'd like to show you is support or identification for a particular political party in the Taiwanese political system. And so traditionally, the two major parties have been the DPP and the KMT. The KMT, for much of the democratic era, has been the leading party, has a plurality of supporters in the electorate. That has changed in recent years. And in fact, the KMT's support has declined pretty dramatically over the last decade, from a peak of almost 40% of all respondents in 2011, now to under 15% of the electorate in 2022. The DPP, conversely, has gained supporters in the electorate. So they're now somewhere in the 30 to 35% range, depending on exactly when you ask. And so the DPP has clearly moved ahead of the KMT in terms of identifiers, people who feel close to that party in the electorate over the last few years. So to sum up Taiwanese public opinion, there's exclusive Taiwanese identity steadily rising. I didn't show you the data on this, but it is highest among youngest adults. And so that kind of secular trend upwards among exclusive Taiwanese identity is almost certain to continue over the next few years. Support for unification has fallen. It's below 5% now. Support for independence has risen, but the majority of Taiwanese still do support some version of the status quo. And then finally, party politics is still organized around competition over national identity and cross-strait relations. And the more China-skeptical party, the DPP, has really surged ahead of the KMT within identifiers in the electorate. People who identify with a political party are now more likely to identify with the DPP than the KMT. All right, so that was a lot. Let me now shift direction and talk a little bit about the recent era. Xi Jinping took power in 2012, became the core leader of the CCP. since that time, what has changed in the cross-strait relationship? In other words, why are people really worried about Taiwan today when they were not so worried a decade ago when Xi Jinping first took power? Well, first off, there is a clear change in the cross-strait balance of power. Part of that is driven by China's rapid economic growth. The PRC has registered roughly 8% growth a year for 40 years. That's enabled their economy to expand multifold. That has given them an economic base to allow rapid military expansion and modernization. I would note that that modernization program was set in place in the mid-1990s as a response to the third Taiwan Strait crisis in 95, 96. And it's only today starting to bear real fruit. So the PRC, this is not some kind of crash course in modernization that Xi Jinping set in motion himself. This is a long-term process of modernization and reform of the military to build a world-class military that has taken a really long time. And it's only now that it's finally producing a set of training, doctrine, and weapons and platforms that can potentially go head-to-head with the United States in a great power conflict. Related and another significant concern from the US and Taiwan's perspective is that Taiwan's own military spending is flat. And so let me show you a couple pictures of military spending in the region over the last couple of decades. I've got the PRC, several peer countries, and Taiwan here. Clearly, the PRC is vaulting ahead of the rest of the countries in the region. If we look just at the PRC and Taiwan, the picture looks pretty dire. So whereas Taiwan was spending about half as much as the PRC was as late as 1996, since then, the PRC's rapid economic growth has allowed them to dedicate a larger and larger amount of money to military activities over that time period. So now they're spending roughly 25 times as much as Taiwan is every year on their defense. Taiwan's military budget has actually stagnated or even declined, even in comparison with some other peer countries in the region. And so you might expect Taiwan to be urgently ramping up military defense over this time period if they're concerned about an invasion. We don't see that actually until very, very recently. In fact, the trend is so recent, I don't have the data for it here. This only goes up until 2018. There has been an expansion in Taiwan's military budget, but it's been only over the last 3 years. And in fact, if we look at military spending as a share of GDP, this is another illustration of the fact that the PRC is not devoting a larger and larger share of their economy to military modernization. It has actually tracked pretty closely and pretty consistently over the past 30 years, or past 20 years at least, about 2% of GDP. And so the PRC still today, according to official numbers, is only spending about 2% of its GDP on the military, as opposed to the United States, who's spending 3.5, maybe 4% of our GDP on military. So bottom line here is that Taiwan used to have a significant qualitative military advantage over the PLA, and that gave the Taiwan side and the US a lot of confidence that in a conflict with the PRC, they would be able to hold their own and perhaps definitively defeat an invasion or any other kind of military coercion. No one is confident of that today. And in fact, increasingly, the Taiwan side's own Air Force and sea patrols are being worn down by the need to come up and challenge and interdict PLA aircraft and sea craft that are coming into Taiwan's air defense identification zone and nearby waters. So there's a lot of concern now that the cross-strait military balance has worsened to a point that Taiwan cannot hold its own and potentially would be defeated very quickly in the event that the PRC decided to launch a full-scale military invasion. So that leads to the third question here. There's a significant number of US debates now about Taiwan and the cross-strait relationship. And front and center in these is whether peace can be preserved across the Taiwan Strait. First, I'll be very frank and note some ominous trends in the cross-strait relationship. Several of these I've touched on earlier in this talk. Taiwan public opinion is clearly not in favor of unification. Taiwan's a democracy. Public opinion ultimately decides what is acceptable for leaders to do and not to do. The support for unification is at a near or below an all-time low. The KMT, the more China-friendly of the two major parties, has been struggling, although they did win in local elections last November. The PLA's military modernization plan is actually bearing significant fruit. There's a lot of concern on the US military establishment that the PLA will have the capability they need to launch a full-scale invasion of Taiwan or impose a blockade or otherwise engaged in some kind of accelerated or stepped-up military coercion against Taiwan within the next decade. And in some cases, you have leading military generals or admirals saying that this could come as early as 2025. There was even someone claiming 2023 a couple of years ago. And in fact, if you go back in time, you can find almost every year that someone in the US military names as the year when the PLA may be prepared or ready to come across the strait. There's also some concerning changes within the PRC. First and foremost, Xi Jinping has consolidated power around his own person. He's ended term limits. He's now clearly in his third term with no end in sight to his rule. He has reasserted CCP dominance over businesses, over civil society, over the media and academia, and he asserted his own dominance within the CCP. And so we've got Xi Jinping as the core leader and chairman of everything. And so it's not clear what that means for Taiwan policy, but it's worrying if Xi Jinping has retaking Taiwan at the top of his priority list, because it's not clear that anybody else in the party has the wherewithal to stop him if he really wanted to launch an invasion. And then finally, there's some significant concern about long-term trends in the US. The global financial crisis that hit in 2008-9 really hit the US hard. Really undermined US status in the eyes of many Chinese elites, increased Chinese confidence that they were destined to win a long-run competition between the US and China. The US pulled out of Iran and Afghanistan after almost 20 years in both places. That contributed to a significant drain on US resources and readiness to fight a great power conflict. There's also lots of writing in China about US domestic polarization, social problems, and so forth that lead many Chinese elites to think that the US is becoming increasingly, perhaps hopelessly divided and unable to overcome our own domestic problems to mount a credible challenge to China's rise. That said, there are some open questions about what to do or about what the long-term trends are in the trilateral relationship. And I'll go through each of these in some detail. The first is timelines and windows of opportunity. So there's a big debate about whether time is on the side of the United States or the PRC. One of the major new works on this is by Hal Brands and Michael Beckley called The Danger Zone. And they have a pretty provocative argument that, number one, time is not on China's side. It's actually on the side of the United States. So they tend to be bearish on China's prospects and bullish on the US's prospects. But that the danger zone, or the really dangerous time in this relationship, is sooner rather than later, because leaders in the PRC can also see that China has peaked, and that it will soon be in a state of stasis or decline, and that their incentive then is to try to move on Taiwan sooner rather than later, before the relative power balance between the US and China widens again. And so Their view is that we're actually entering a very, very dangerous decade, and that we should be very alarmed about the prospect of a near-term attempt to move on Taiwan and to resolve the Taiwan issue definitively. There's a second debate about deterrence, about what kinds of deterrence or what deters in the cross-strait relationship. There's a debate between, I would call them the China hawks, who are think that the best way to stop China from coming after Taiwan is to convince the Chinese leadership that the United States' hard military power in combination with partners and allies is significant enough to ensure a defeat of the PLA, and that nothing else is as important as the military balance. And in fact, the US and partners and allies, as a corollary, need to rapidly ramp up our military posture in the region, or otherwise Xi Jinping is going to come across the strait as soon as he thinks he can win. There's an alternative view that deterrence is actually upheld as much by maintaining US long-term commitments in the trilateral relationship, not supporting independence, not supporting closer US-Taiwan military ties, and reassuring Beijing that the US does not oppose eventual unification if it's done under mutual agreement between the two sides. In other words, the US is not moving away from our longstanding one China policy, and that the military aspects kind of overstate the importance of the hard power element and understate the importance of economic sanctions or economic costs that China might pay if they attempted to move on Taiwan. There's also a question about how the US might reassure Beijing that our one China policy remains in place, that it might that we're not hollowing it out. And the flip side of that is, can Beijing credibly reassure the United States that they are not going to move on Taiwan if we do not ramp up military engagement with the Taiwanese and partners and allies? Can they reassure us that a military option is off the table for them? That's a difficult problem that we're not very close to solving right now, to come into some kind of mutual agreement that's credible. There's a third debate about whether Taiwan can even be defended anymore. Even if the US brings everything we have, if partners and allies are involved, Taiwan is close to the PRC mainland. It's very far from the United States. The PRC, if they moved quickly, might be able to take Taiwan before the US could respond. At least that's an open question. And so on one side of the equation, you have a number of, I would call them kind of concessionists, people who say the United States and Taiwan and partners and allies should basically cut a deal with Beijing, try to extract as many concessions from Beijing in return for washing our hands of the Taiwan issue and pledging not to come to Taiwan's assistance if Beijing moves on Taiwan, encouraging Taiwan to negotiate with Beijing for some kind of union under the best terms possible from the Taiwanese perspective. But simply put, from their view, Taiwan can no longer be effectively defended, and the sooner we recognize that, the better deal the US and Taiwan will get from Beijing. On the flip side of that, there's a lot of, I think, there's a lot of writing from people with a lot of different views on this broader issue of Taiwan's importance to the US that point out that the PLA still has a significant number of weaknesses. The PRC still is quite vulnerable strategically to its own, to potentially a US blockade. There's significant concern, for instance, about about the PRC's access to energy supplies in the Middle East and beyond. And there's lots of ways that the US can still effectively intervene in a conflict that would prevent a fait accompli, so prevent the PRC from consolidating control over Taiwan under PRC rule. And then there's a fourth debate about how important Taiwan is to Xi Jinping. So number one, has Xi Jinping, unlike other leaders, switched from a policy of deterring independence as his core goal to actually compelling unification? So does he need to see positive movement towards unification in the next few years, or if he doesn't, he will use force to compel the Taiwan side to capitulate. So on one side of this debate is my colleague here at Stanford, Oriana Mastro, who's been quite prominent in arguing that Xi Jinping places a high priority on Taiwan. It's part of his China dream for great national rejuvenation, and that if he doesn't have Taiwan, he can't complete that goal that he's set for himself. And so he's willing to bear a huge number of costs and take a lot of risks if there's a possibility that he could complete unification under his rule. On the other side, there's a number of scholars who followed this issue for a long time, arguing the opposite, that Beijing still can afford to be patient. It's playing the long game. It isn't poised to invade. One of these is the longtime scholar Andrew Nathan. And so you see this debate playing out right now on the pages of Foreign Affairs. Almost every issue has something on this topic. So I'll get to my own view in a moment, but I'll just note that this is far from a settled conversation today. The key question in my mind is, how important is Taiwan to Xi personally? Since he's so powerful within the CCP, it seems difficult for a kind of decisive coalition to rise up against him if he actually wanted to move on Taiwan. There's an open question about whether he has set an internal deadline for unification, whether he's willing to bear how high is the cost he's willing to bear to achieve unification, or something else. So finally, last section here, and I'll speak for just a couple more minutes here before we turn it over to you and your questions. I want to make my own case for a more optimistic take than a lot of the kind of doomsayers writing in some of the prominent outlets that you may consume these days. So I'm going to make my case for optimism. That peace can, I think, be preserved across the Taiwan Strait into the indefinite future. First, I would note the status quo is not an existential threat to the CCP. If Taiwan remains de facto autonomous, but not de jure independent, the CCP has actually survived with that state of the world for the last 73 years. It has never controlled Taiwan, and it has in fact survived in power in the PRC, and it has prospered in power for the last 40 years without controlling Taiwan. And so we know by definition the regime can continue to exist if it does not exert political control over the island or people of Taiwan. Second, and related, only if the US moves towards open support for independence or cuts off any possibility of unification, or if Taiwan leaders declare independence, does this become elevated much closer to an existential threat to the CCP. And so on this note, on this point, I'd note there was a debate or a kind of controversy within the US State Department. At one point, they removed a line on their fact sheet on their website stating US policy towards Taiwan. That line critically said, "We do not support Taiwan independence." And the reason that removal was important was that it did kind of shift US policy. If that was an official statement of US policy, away from support for the status quo and towards an open de jure recognition of Taiwan, either as an independent country or as a place whose people and leadership can unilaterally decide their own future. That has never been US policy from 1979 forward. If we were to make that shift, that would, in my view, elevate this to a much more critical situation for the CCP. So I should note that line is now back on the State Department website in the description of Taiwan. So third, I note the kind of silver lining to Xi Jinping's consolidation of power within the CCP is that nobody besides Xi is going to give the order to invade Taiwan. There's not going to be immense domestic pressure on him to move on Taiwan. And he's got a pretty free hand to decide whether he's going to set a deadline, whether he's going to move or not move. If he doesn't move, in fact, he's not going to be backed into a corner on this issue. He can simply say, redefine the problem or kind of kick the can down the road if he needs to, in my view. Second reason for optimism, I think Taiwan leaders are embracing the status quo more and more. So I'll just note one anecdote. Tsai Ing-wen, even though she's from the DPP, which fought against the Jiang Jingguo regime, Jiang Jingguo was the last dictator of Taiwan. She actually gave a surprising speech at the opening of the Jiang Jingguo Museum and Memorial Library that actually praised Jiang Jingguo's legacy as an anti-communist fighter and somebody who stood up for the Republic of China institutions and started the process of democratization in Taiwan. And so by giving that speech, she actually moved her own party's position much closer to the traditional KMT narrative about both Jiang Jingguo and the process of democratization in Taiwan. And so there is, if you squint, there's actually quite a bit of overlap between the two major parties' positions on both cross-strait relations and on the kind of institutional and cultural legacy that Taiwan enjoys today. So I don't think Taiwan leaders, whether they're from the DPP or the KMT, are going to push for dramatic changes in the status quo. So Taiwan is not going to be the big problem in this relationship going forward. Third, I tend to be quite bearish on China and China's future. I think the PRC is hitting a wall. Demographically, their population actually apparently shrunk last year for the first time since 1960. That population is likely to continue to shrink over the next few years. The demographic decline is already baked in because of the one-child policy and a dramatic reduction in the number of births over the last few years. Basically, China is where Japan was 15 years ago, but it's a lot less rich. It is a lot less economically prosperous, and it's not a democracy. When Japan went through this started this demographic transition, it actually went through 20 years of almost zero growth. The democratic regime was able to survive because voters could kick out the incumbent and vote in new leadership. In China, they can't. And so I think increasingly this model of growth that has been predicated on a kind of demographic dividend is becoming increasingly untenable. And now the PRC's leadership is going to have to struggle to find a new model to unlock the next phase of growth. They haven't shown any signs of thinking creatively about how to do that. So I expect growth in China to slow down pretty dramatically over the next few years, in large part because of this demographic downturn. Economically, they've also, if anything, moved in the wrong direction. The Xi regime has exerted increasing party control over the PRC's most vibrant sectors of the economy. So the tech sector, Xi has moved to rein in their entrepreneurial efforts. A lot more money and state resources are going to state-owned or state-backed enterprises, and they're just generally less efficient than the purely private parts of the economy. And so I think they're doing exactly the wrong thing if you're trying to unlock the next phase of growth in China. This is a slide from a class I teach here at Stanford on Taiwan politics. This plots Taiwan's GDP per capita from the moment when Taiwan and the PRC, this takes the PRC from 1978, plots growth in GDP per capita going forward, and Taiwan's GDP per capita since 1953 going forward. And you'll note they follow a very similar trajectory for the first 20 years. But then over the remaining 20 years, the PRC's trajectory has fallen further and further behind Taiwan's trajectory. And so if we're taking the other Asian tigers, Taiwan being the most relevant here, the PRC is actually, I think, underperforming what the other Asian tigers were able to accomplish in their third and fourth decades of miracle growth. And in fact, this trajectory suggests that the PRC is actually in a much worse spot than Taiwan or South Korea or Hong Kong or Singapore were when their demographic dividend ended. And so for this reason as well, I'm fairly bearish on China's future. Another way to put this is I do think we have come close to peak China. And in fact, the PRC is going to be confronted with an increasingly serious set of economic challenges over the next decade. Politically, Xi Jinping has centralized all authority within his own person, within his own office. He's the chairman of everything. PRC leaders like to talk about the Gorbachev example in the Soviet Union as the kind of reform, the cautionary tale about political reform leading to the destruction of the regime. I have a colleague here at Stanford who argues that they should be paying less attention to Gorbachev and more attention to the precedent of Brezhnev in the Soviet Union. And Xi, Mike McFall, my colleague here, argues that Xi looks a lot like Brezhnev, in fact. And there's some striking parallels in the way that Brezhnev refused to entertain any idea of kind of serious political reform, and that actually contributed to both economic and political stagnation and eventual decline in the Soviet Union. And so if you're trying to project the PRC's political future out, I think a better model for the PRC is perhaps late era Soviet Union rather than rather than a kind of turbocharged Singapore or something along those lines. And then finally, the effects of all of this suggest that the PRC, if they've hit peak China, they're going to face an increasingly serious set of internal challenges. I tend to argue against the Beckley and Brand's view that we're in a danger zone. I think the PRC's past history suggests when they face significant internal challenges or turmoil, they tend to be less aggressive in the interstate system rather than more. So I've got a couple examples here. Tiananmen, the PRC was actually kind of consolidated internal authority again, the CCP did, and they generally were much less belligerent in the interstate system after Tiananmen for several years. And during the Cultural Revolution, the PRC turned very much inward and had minimal presence in the interstate system, were quite isolated during that time period. And so, if anything, that past history suggests if they run into some serious domestic problems, they're likely to be less antagonistic with adversaries rather than more antagonistic. And I'm happy to elaborate on this point in Q&A. Fourth, I think the military option for Xi Jinping is still very unattractive. What the PLA wants people to think about is the military exercises they held last August in response to Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. They wanted to demonstrate and threaten the fact that they might be able to impose a blockade on Taiwan. But in practice, I think what they would have to do to take Taiwan and accomplish political unification is a full-on military invasion across a 90-mile body of water. And in fact, that's the most difficult mission the military can undertake. You have to plan for full-scale conflict, not only with Taiwan, but potentially with the US, Japan, and US allies and partners in the region and beyond. And so I think the precedent here is not some kind of quick, easy, swift victory where the Taiwanese side capitulates, but something more like US battles in the Pacific in World War II, say in Okinawa, or Iwo Jima, or perhaps the U.S. invasion of the Normandy landings in World War II are sometimes raised as a parallel here. And I think all of those should really cause cooler heads to prevail in Beijing. Related to that, the PLA has zero warfighting experience over the last 40 years. Because of that, I think Xi Jinping has significant reasons to doubt the efficacy of the military if they were to get into a hot conflict. They're just completely untested at this point. And so there's a lot of downside risk if he chooses the military option. The expected economic costs are huge. Not only would a war with the United States involve potentially significant destruction and casualties, but the U.S. Has the ability to blockade China's energy supplies. And note, a huge share of their energy comes from overseas, and the U.S. could quite plausibly stop most of those energy shipments from getting into mainland China. And so there are some significant downside risks on that front as well. And then finally, the PRC's global model, economic model, depends on access to world markets. They have an approximately $800 billion trade surplus with the rest of the world. About half of that is with the United States. Starting a war with the US means they'd have to kiss that goodbye. That would cause some massive economic disruption domestically. If you're already in a position where you're dealing with difficult economic challenges, why would you do that? Is a big part of my argument. So last slide here, and then I'll wrap up. Finally, I think the U.S. commitment to Taiwan actually looks pretty credible today. On the one hand, there are deepening economic ties. The U.S. actually relies heavily on the most advanced semiconductor chips produced predominantly in Taiwan for its own industries. The U.S. commitment to allies and partners in the region is at stake in a Taiwan contingency. And so the U.S., I think, has pretty credible and pretty obvious reasons why it would intervene in a Taiwan conflict. Also, the U.S. response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been, I think, at the upper end of expectations. The kind of European unity behind that response has been, again, on the upper end of expectations. It suggests the Chinese should be very cautious or very concerned about what a move on Taiwan might mean in terms of a Western response. And there's also been, in response to Ukraine, some significant shifts among U.S. partners and allies in recent years, and an increasing willingness to talk about the Taiwan issue and to engage in some frank conversations with the U.S. about how to plan for Taiwan contingency. So all of these things, I think, signal to China that the U.S. is likely to be involved and very likely to bring along a significant number of partners and allies in some way, shape, or form if we had to intervene to defend Taiwan. And so generally, I think there is a reasonable case to be made that the cross-strait status quo can be preserved for the foreseeable future. And the consequence of that is that we can maintain peace across the Taiwan Strait. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thanks for listening to this very long talk. And I will turn it back over to Larry.
Karis. So I'm overwhelmed. So my first question is, are you sure you didn't go to MIT?
I wasn't good enough to get into MIT.
You know, this was just enormous amount of data, amount of knowledge, amount of information. It's just overwhelming. And you know, you hit it right on the head. You know, the questions that I sent you the other day that were pre-submitted, you covered most of those. You know, they're all in here. Just fabulous. You know, I see a couple of comments here. Fabulous talk. Thank you so much. Great talk. Okay, first question. How do we de-escalate? What would you suggest could be done to de-escalate?
Yeah, great question. I think, well, I noted earlier, we're in what I think is a pretty obvious security dilemma over Taiwan. And the problem with those security dilemmas is that both sides are misinterpreting the other's moves. So we're interpreting Beijing's threats or punishments against the Tsai administration as increasing risk-taking and increasing willingness to use military coercion or force to get what they want out of Taiwan. And we're responding by selling more arms to Taiwan, by talking to partners and allies, by providing more international support for Taiwan, by potentially shifting our own one China policy to relax some of the constraints on US-Taiwan engagement. And then Beijing sees all of that and doesn't interpret it as a response to their actions, but interprets it instead as the US wants to use Taiwan to keep China down. I think there's a pretty, if you spend some time in this area, it doesn't take long to realize that's kind of each side's perspective of what's happening across the strait. And so then the question is, how do you reverse that? How do you communicate to the other side that, no, we're not actually seeking to change the status quo in a direction that hurts the other side's interest? And I think you have to start at the leader to leader level. There's so much uncertainty on our side about Xi Jinping's own motives, his own priority of Taiwan over other issues. I think this has to be a Biden-Xi conversation about Taiwan's future and what each side will do. And it probably should start with both sides kind of reiterating fundamental principles, the US reiterating our pledge to maintain our one China policy, that we do not support independence, that we are not in favor of unilateral changes to the status quo. Kind of these, it's an almost ritualistic formulation, but like a lot of ritual, it's comforting. There's a certain kind of predictability to it that hasn't been there over the last few years. And so I think for the most part, the Biden administration has done a decent job of this, but on some occasions, and in particular with President Biden's kind of off-the-cuff remarks about Taiwan, I think he's undercut some of that messaging. And so it would help if we had a speech or some kind of statement from our own side about our Taiwan policy, laying out why we're doing what we're doing, and reiterating to the PRC side what our core principles are. And if that could be delivered both publicly and in private conversations with Xi. We have to figure out how to get to that point, I think, before we can reverse this insecurity spiral.
Are there private conversations going on, not just between the US and the PRC, but also between, say, Taiwan and the PRC?
There are, although there are very few between the current government of Taiwan and the PRC. So there is significant engagement between the opposition KMT and people in Beijing. The deputy chair of the KMT was just in Beijing a couple of weeks ago to meet with Politburo member Wang Huning. And so one possible way that this de-escalates, and I don't want to suggest that this is a net positive or negative for Taiwan or the US-Taiwan relationship, but one possible way that this could de-escalate is if the KMT wins the next presidential election. Beijing inherently is going to trust a KMT counterpart more than a DPP counterpart. The KMT is definitely going to make that case in the campaign for the next presidential election. And so the Taiwan electorate could play a role in kind of shifting things in the trilateral relationship in a way that reverses potentially this insecurity spiral. But I wouldn't count on that. The DPP, I think, is still probably the favorite going into the next election. The front runner for the DPP nomination has a reputation as being a bit more pro-independence or a bit less reticent to talk about independence than the current president, Tsai Ing-wen. And so I think it's equally likely that you get a bit more kind of turbulence as a result of the campaign for the presidency over the next year, then you get some kind of stabilizing effect.
You and I talked about TSMC the other day, and it was one of your last slides. And so sort of think through that, is Xi's goal, Xi's driving China. So is Xi's goal territorial or is it economic? And if it seems like TSMC is, from our perspective, is a huge linchpin. Suppose we were able to, or it was possible that TSMC moved completely out of Taiwan. Yeah. And we offered visas to anyone on Taiwan that we thought would help our economy. The smart people, the technical people, the scientific people, the educated people, and kind of what we did with Germany after World War II.
Yeah, Operation Paperclip, right?
Yeah, but That's sort of, is it economic and technical, or is it geography?
So I don't think TSMC itself matters much at all in Xi's calculations. I think this is a longstanding goal of the CCP that goes back to June 1950.
Yep.
It doesn't matter who the leader is. It doesn't matter whether Taiwan is economically prosperous or the last bastion of a desperate, bankrupt, immoral regime that has escaped over there. The CCP's long-term goal has been to end that regime and to subsume Taiwan and its people under PRC control. And so the presence of TSMC, I think, matters in a different way for this relationship, in that it actually makes the US commitment to intervene more credible. And in fact, there's a rather ironic kind of implication of the fact that the US depends so heavily on semiconductor chips made in Taiwan for its own economy. And that is, if the US, and in fact, US policymakers have been pushing TSMC and Taiwan leaders to try to diversify their production outside of Taiwan, because we're worried about what a conflict over Taiwan might mean for our access to that supply. But by diversifying outside of Taiwan, we actually lower the stakes for ourselves. We make it potentially less likely or less beneficial to intervene in a conflict. And the PRC can see that as well. And so right now, the fact that we're on the hook, that we would be severely hurt by the loss of access to Taiwan's exports, actually makes our commitment to intervene more credible. And so I actually think, well, number one, TSMC will never do this. They're a Taiwanese company at heart. Their leadership is Taiwanese. Their leading production will always be in Taiwan, even if they're diversifying some of it outside of Taiwan. But I think it would be a big mistake in terms of cross-strait stability for TSMC to move a huge amount of its production outside of the island of Taiwan. So in other words, I think TSMC's presence in Taiwan proper actually has a stabilizing effect on the trilateral relationship rather than destabilizing.
Could be. Someone's asking if you would turn off your screen share.
Yes. Yeah, I can get out of here. Sorry. Thanks.
So what are the hot buttons? What do you think would be the hot buttons that would upset peace and cause war? What are the there's 3, 4, or 5, it's got to be more than words.
Yeah. So I think there are variables that could affect and lead to a hot conflict that are present in all 3 of the players in this trilateral relationship. So let me start with the US side. If we were to have an administration that comes in that is much more hawkish towards China, even than the current administration, that is completely gives up on the idea of maintaining the peace across the strait through some kind of combination of deterrence and reassurance, that says we're all in on military support for Taiwan. And in fact, we want to put troops on Taiwan. We want to normalize diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Who cares what the PRC thinks? There are some purported candidates for president in the next election who have actually advocated that publicly. In fact, one of them flew to Taiwan and said it directly in public in Taiwan. And so if someone like that were to become the next president, I think that could, unless it was walked back or somehow managed, could potentially trigger, force Beijing to feel like they needed to do something much more serious and substantive to indicate that was completely unacceptable to them. So that on the US side, we could potentially trigger it. On the Taiwan side, you could have a leader who comes into office probably from the DPP, who is much less reticent to speak about changing the cross-strait status quo in favor of independence. And to be fair, Tsai Ing-wen has been very careful not to rock the boat. And she's gotten 0 from Beijing for maintaining the cross-strait status quo. And in fact, Beijing has punished her. And so the next leader, from the DPP, comes into office and says, Tsai did all of these things that the US wanted her to do, that Beijing wanted her to do, and they got nothing out of it. So why should we conform to that? Why don't we just, if they're going to punish us anyway, why don't we go ahead with all of the changes that we want to do? And so you could have a leader in Taiwan who actually sparks a kind of potentially a military action to punish Taiwan for unilateral shifts. And then the spark or the hot button that gets the most attention, I think, is Xi Jinping himself. And whether he's the thing I worry most about is we don't know how he gets information about Taiwan. We don't know how he formulates Taiwan policy. We don't know who's advising him. And so I worry a little bit about a very small clique of people around him who aren't telling him everything, just only telling him what he wants to hear, delivering good news, not bad, exaggerating the prospects of victory, quick victory, swift, costless or almost costless. And so you could have Xi Jinping kind of existing in this epistemic bubble that doesn't conform very much to reality, and then ordering a quick move on Taiwan that leads to a conflict. And then once you're in a conflict, as the Russian invasion of Ukraine shows, it's very hard to kind of settle things down once the bullets start flying. So I worry a little bit about that as well.
Yeah. Boy, almost 2 hours.
Yeah, I took.
Karis, you are just fabulous. You are just fantastic. It's such a wealth of knowledge. And there are a lot of questions here. I think, and people are starting to fade off. I think we could go on for another hour, and I probably would, but I know that wouldn't be right. Maybe a couple of final questions. What are your best sources of information? What do you read? Who do you trust? Honest, objective.
Yeah, good question. So you asked who my influencers were, who I who shaped my thinking about this issue, and there's a couple like senior people in the field who I feel uncomfortable if I ever take a position at odds with them on the Taiwan issue. One is Richard Bush, who's a longtime figure in this field. He's written a dozen books on or policy papers on Taiwan issues. He's very thoughtful. Knows this issue, I think, better than anyone living today in the U.S.
And where is he? Where is he?
He's at the Brookings Institution. He's emeritus now, but still very active and writes and appears regularly. Another is Bonnie Glaser, who's at the German Marshall Fund now.
Right.
She's also very thoughtful, and they often co-author stuff together. So I take my lead from them on a lot of issues when I'm trying to figure out how I think about a new piece of news or that sort of thing. In terms of news sources, I'd just give a shout out to Financial Times. This might surprise some people, but they have scooped, or they've come up with some exclusive stories on Taiwan repeatedly throughout the last several years that have been really quite eye-opening. And so they actually broke the news, for instance, that Michael Chase, our DASD, our Defense Assistant Secretary of Defense for China, is in Taiwan, or was in Taiwan recently. They also broke the news that there's a Taiwan delegation headed to Washington, D.C. that's going to include the foreign minister from Taiwan. And so their reporting is very good, and often they're reporting stuff that nobody else can get access to. So
that's FT.
That's FT, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Any advice for people who want to go into this field?
Well, I'll just let me reflect on my own journey here for a little bit. I remark every day to myself how amazing it is I'm in this position, because I thought I was committing career suicide by specializing on Taiwan. 10 years ago, the future for a Taiwan expert looked pretty bleak. And I decided I didn't care. I loved the subject. I was really fascinated by the place and the people and the government. And I decided I wanted to specialize in that anyway. And ultimately, I zigged while the rest of my discipline zagged and just specialized in China. And so I guess one takeaway is find something you're passionate about, really invested in and can spend every day thinking about, and go with that. And chances are, if you really do love it, you're going to become very knowledgeable, very invested in it, and you're likely to bring some special expertise or knowledge that nobody else in the world has. The other is, if you're interested in this set of issues broadly, I'm a political scientist by training. I have a PhD in political science. For some people, that's a sensible path to get into this field, but you certainly don't need a PhD to work on, diplomacy or policy issues. In fact, the majority of people in, say, DC think tanks today do not have that sort of degree. And so I would, look at internships or coursework that kind of funnels people into master's programs that, like at Johns Hopkins, SAIS, or Tufts, or even here at Stanford.
Yeah, Georgetown.
So, Georgetown, George Washington, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. Karis, this has just been fabulous. Yeah, you're just tremendous. You're such a great resource.
Well,
and you've made such a contribution to this field.
Yeah, well, thank you for the kind words. And I should note, if anybody has additional questions, they'd like to follow up with me. I really consumed more time than I wanted to this evening. I'm happy to speak with people or email with people if anybody has follow-up questions on this topic.
Yeah.
My email is just my first name at stanford.edu, so I'm easy to reach that way.
Yeah, it's such a unique first name. And what you told me the other day is in Greek, it means grace.
Correct. Yeah.
Or charisma.
Or charisma, right.
Yeah, good for you. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has just been it's been a terrific evening, a terrific experience. And thanks to our audience for the astute questions. There were a lot of them, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. But we're not finished quite yet. We have an upcoming event. Teddy, if you could go to the next slide. Our next event in the World Affairs series is on misinformation. We have Professor Adam Berinsky, also a poli-scientist,
and also a Michigan PhD. I have to give a shout out here.
You're right. Yeah. Another Michigan guy. Yeah. Go blue, huh? So he's here on Tuesday, April 11th at 5:30. So we're looking forward to that very much. So thank you all, and have a great evening and a great week.
All right. Thanks again, Larry, for having me. It's been a delight to speak with you all today.
Thank you.